Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Warp Core Podcast. I am Urza Master. Joining me, as always, Lord Uther and Fert Derby, our resident expert. Welcome, fellas. Back to Starfleet Academy, back to Starfleet headquarters, back to this journey we're on through Season 2 of the original series of Star Trek. I'm actually really excited to talk about this episode. It is The Ultimate Computer, in which we meet a Star Trek legend. In name, we've talked about locations bearing his name before, but have yet to talk about the person himself. But I would be remiss if I stepped on any of the toes of Fert Derby, however many he may have. Fert Derby, take us away with this episode of Star Trek, the original series.
Thank you, Urza Master. Thank you, Lord Uther. And welcome back, Trekkies. We are winding down our second season of the original series of Star Trek. And tonight, we journey back in time to March 8th, 1968, for The Ultimate Computer. The director of this, it's a first-time director, but you know his name, John Meredith Lucas, who has replaced DC Fontana and Gene Coon basically now as the day-to-day nuts and bolts Star Trek showrunner. Fontana and Coon are still contributing, still even writing episodes, as you'll see shortly. But as far as having to get Shatner out of his trailer, making sure the sets don't collapse, yelling at the special effects team to hurry up already, they're going to be on the air Thursday, that's now John Meredith Lucas's job. And so he said, why not just double my workload and I'll direct for the first time. And so that's what he absolutely chose to do here. This story actually comes over the transom. It was easier to submit unsolicited stuff back in 1968, apparently, if you were a writer. And we had a mathematician and Trek fan named Lawrence N. Wolfe, who, in his spare time, when he wasn't mathematicianing, decided to write a spec Star Trek script. And it was actually given to legendary science fiction author Ray Bradbury, whom Wolfe knew socially. And he asked Ray to pass the script along to Gene Roddenberry. And that's just kind of how these things worked back in 1968. You make friends with a legendary science fiction author, you write a script, you say, hey, can you get this to Gene Roddenberry? Oh, sure. And then Ray and Gene go play golf, and then somewhere on the 14th hole, hey, I got a script for you. I'll leave it in the cart. So I'm sure that's how that went, but it's a little bit tougher now, I think, to get stuff to Paramount, for what it's worth. And then it was rewritten, and eventually the final product is credited to DC Fontana, who is no longer show running but is still writing. So we have a story by Lawrence Wolfe, we have a teleplay by DC Fontana, and we have a first-time director with John Meredith Lucas. Now, gentlemen, there are lots of episodic points that we can dwell on, but I kind of want to take us a different approach here because I'm very curious. My reaction to this episode will depend on your answers to the following question. So I'm going to put both of you on the spot here, Lord Uther and Urza Master. Gentlemen, would you agree that a Starfleet captain is responsible for the safety and well-being of his crew? This is a softball question. You would agree?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yes.
Now,
Yes.
would you agree or disagree that a Starfleet captain is responsible for the actions of his crew if, let's say, there was a peace treaty and one of his crew members went rogue and tried to sabotage it or do something like that? Should the captain of that vessel ultimately not be responsible for something that his crew members may or may not do, but should he be held accountable for them nevertheless?
Yeah, I think by typical Starfleet rules, that would be the case.
Yes.
Okay,
Accountable, not responsible. I think those are two different things.
they are. But accountable, we can't agree. Okay, so gentlemen, here is my biggest single major problem with the ultimate computer, which otherwise, as Urza Master suggested, is a very exciting episode to talk about. In fact, before I give the major problem, let me just say the single biggest thing that this episode does from 1968 and March 8th to today, 56 years later, how relevant is its theme of technology trying to replace us in the workforce, or technology that's so new and advanced we can't comprehend just what the parameters of the envelope are. It literally feels like this script could have been written yesterday to deal with tomorrow. And, you know, sometimes when you throw the dart and you hit it center square bullseye, you just have to give credit to where credit is due. And this is an episode that is one of the first timeless Star Trek episodes. It's not unencumbered by, you know, dated 1960s special effects or visions of what the future could have looked like. This really can speak to any audience member, you know, in the 21st century, in 2024 now. And it can talk about things that we're going to be grappling with for the next 30, 40, 100 years. You know, this idea of automation coming in and being better than any human capacity. And I think, you know, obviously a much quoted line delivered in as only Captain Kirk can deliver it. There are certain things men must do to remain men. And I think that speaks volumes. And I think DC Fontana and Lawrence and Wolf nailed it with that approach. That being said, gentlemen, I'm going to pivot right to my bugaboo. In that the M5 computer, which takes over and fully automates the Enterprise, ends up causing the deaths of, as it's quoted in the episode, hundreds of Starfleet crew members, innocent crew members, who are just participating in a war game. It is suggested, though never shown on screen like the bodies, that every crew member of the USS Excalibur perishes thanks to the Enterprise's attack. And there are also casualties, wounded, I'm sure a few deaths on the Lexington, commanded by Wesley, Captain Wesley. And so when Captain Wesley gets the green light to blow the Enterprise out of the sky because he believes, you know, Kirk has gone rogue and is, you know, literally using live ammunition in a training exercise. I mean, this is as high stakes as we've ever seen our crew members. Big screen, little screen, whatever. Starfleet just gave the green light to blow NCC 1701 out of the stars. And my issue with that is not that it's just one of the most gripping, dramatic plot points that we've ever seen in a Star Trek feature or television show of any generation. But it's the fact that once we get to that final denouement, and I'm sure Lord Uther and Urza Master will weigh in on how we get this all resolved, then it's back to business as normal, right? The episode even ends with Spock, you know, tweaking McCoy at being illogical and dun da dun 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 dun. And it appears that James Kirk and the crew, now we're audience members. We don't want to see Kirk thrown in chains and court-martialed. And I mean, I'm not advocating that the show suddenly comes to a halt and James Kirk is tried as a war criminal. But what I'm saying is there's a curious lack of probing of what has really happened. And at the very least, I think the episode almost demands something a little more somber, a little more City on the Edge of Forever, perhaps, at the end, than how it ultimately plays out. I don't believe it's enough to derail the episode. I'm not going to penalize all the good that the episode has in it, and it has a lot for this, but it felt not only incomplete, but I just didn't I was not with it at the end with the, oh, we're just back on the bridge and everything's fine. And boy, tough break with the Excalibur, huh? Or, or hey, Wesley, no hard feelings. I know you basically, had the green light to blow us up. But yeah, we're good. I'll catch you at the next star base. So, gentlemen, that's where I'm going to throw this hot potato, this hot tribble in your laps. Explain to me whether Kirk should be held accountable, even though we as the audience don't really want to see that, and I get it. But go with me on this and tell me what I'm feeling.
Well, I think I think you're right. I think this episode is missing a denouement where Dr. Daystrom gets what's coming to him. I don't think in this case Kirk is necessarily accountable. I mean, he and the small crew are basically along to observe. They're not really in charge of the ship. It's between Daystrom and M5 that everything unfolds. Now, Daystrom for sure should be held accountable for his machine. The thing is, he's essentially lost his mind at the end of this episode. Now, I think it's worth noting that in all likelihood, what happened to Daystrom after this is part of the subtext for Section 31, the Daystrom Institute, and all of the nefarious things that we see in the Picard series. I think it all stems from that. Certainly, probably would have been an awesome callback in Picard to have an M6 or something of the like, be the mind behind the security design. M6 controlling, Moriarty, or maybe Moriarty is M6. They've adapted him. Being the fact that it's already been written, obviously we can't change it now, but that would have been a great sort of tie-in. But I think for sure you needed a little bit of that. I would have loved to see a somber end to this episode. I think the problem with doing that, though, especially at the time, is one, this is a terribly somber time just in general for this country, 1968. It's a pretty heavy episode. Everything that's happening, like you were as trapped as our beloved crew members in this episode, watching this unfold, seeing this tremendous loss of life and being ostensibly powerless to stop it. So I think in that regard, like, it's really great what happens in this episode. It's also a big testament to these captains we never get to see. The guys that punch the clock, that are out there just operating as regular everyday captains. Again, like we get in Picard with Captain Shaw, up until, of course, his life is derailed by Picard and Riker and Seven of Nine, which is, again, for all of our fans who have not watched the Picard series, please do yourself a favor. Rewind in our archives here. Click subscribe if you haven't already. Go back and watch our takes on that series. Watch the series with us. Fabulous. But absolutely, I think it shows you that there's a tremendous amount of courage and trust among Starfleet captains. And that's a strength that I think needs to be demonstrable in the Federation. When you're thinking of the era in which this is produced, you want to believe that the humanity out there is what carries us through. And that's why M5 will never be able to replace a living, breathing Starfleet crew. So it's a bit of parallel storytelling. I think at the same time, you also have to acknowledge that there's a lot they could have done with this episode that they didn't, and I think it almost makes it more impactful. For instance, they never really address in any way, shape, or form, subtextual or textual, that Dr. Daystrom is a black man. And I think it's really important to bring up because this is 1968, this episode is released. This is the most influential person in Starfleet. In the future, a black man is the most influential scientist. And in 1968, you had some very influential figures in this huge upheaval in the United States. And I think that's, we'll talk about this in a later episode where Star Trek breaks this racial ground. But I think that's really the standout part of this episode. in my opinion. I think, you know, it shows that there is such amazing potential in people, and amazing potential in technology. And either way, you have to be cautious because people are inherently flawed, as are machines and technology. There has to be some, grappling with how the future unfolds. And I think that's the story that really needed to be told. Not so much the emotional impact of how things unfold, but there had to be that sort of unstated ponderance. You know what I mean? Like, I forget the captain's name who has the ultimate call, right? He's thinking through the situation. He's demonstrating that human thought process that M5 does not have, and he's like, Enterprise wouldn't lower its shields unless there was something going on that was worth looking into further, other than just wasting him. M5 would not have made the same decision. Eliminate the target. So the humanity aspect of it, I think, speaks more to, the viewership. Take away what you will of this, but these are the broad ideas. This is an episode of discussion. And it's a beautiful thing because, like you said, it is timeless because it brings up discussions that can be had across generations. And I think all of those discussions are still very much apropos today and will be probably for a very long time until kind of we've resolved every issue here, whether it's the race issue, the future of humanity, technology, AI. It's just very exciting. But if you're talking about feeling complete and just getting that little payoff at the end, again, I think that goes back to our desire for instant gratification. I would have liked to see a little bit of, and in the ensuing years, Dr. Daystrom was rehabilitated and had to face his crimes as a, but how do you hold it against the guy? I mean, he's trying to prove himself. He's trying to bring this new technology to light that could save millions, billions of lives, and eliminate, tedium for, it's kind of like being the guy who figured out how to genetically engineer corn, arguably saved billions of lives by being able to feed more people. What are the potential risks? I mean, we don't know, but I mean, we kind of know there aren't any, but, it's one of those things that's like, this is a discussion that should be had. You should always be skeptical. And I think that's what they were aiming for, more so than making us feel great or making us feel somber. And that might actually be, we'll put it out there, an edge over City on the Edge of Tomorrow for this episode.
I think this would have been a great two-parter.
Ooh.
Maybe part of that, the second part would be Daystrom on some type of trial, because I feel like he's almost has like a sainthood in Star Trek history. This is not saint-like. And let's take it a step further. He imprints his own brain patterns into M5, which I'm correct on that, right?
His engram.
So why wouldn't you use a Vulcan who's purely logical for something like that versus a human? But does that show that he's extremely cocky about who he is, which leads into this whole AI thing, like right now, I mean, with what we're kind of going through in a sense, the idea that who's programmed, because there is some kind of logic behind all the AI that's out there, and it's coming from someone's thought process, right? It's not completely sentient yet. So I think that's a whole nother thing. And I felt like the ending was kind of rushed. But here's my question too. What's the difference between M5 and Data? Is there a difference? Is Data a more advanced version? Which brings us to the absolutely wonderful episode in Next Generation, where Picard is fighting for Data's existence in a sense, which we'll get there. Warp Core fans, don't worry about it. We'll get there. Which just again proves how beautiful TNG is. So I think there's a lot at play. Here's my issue with the episode. And I think you guys know what I'm going to say.
I know exactly what you're going to say.
Let me phrase it this way. Britney Spears said it best. Oops, I did it again. I mean, it's the same. He talks the computer like he's more logical than the computer again.
I looked it
And I'm
up.
struggling with this.
This is the fourth time he's done that so far. In 4 episodes, Return of the Archons, The Changeling, and I think there was another one somewhere in there, obviously. But this is the fourth occasion where Kirk monologues a computer. Yes, I did look it up.
Who needs the Daystrom Institute? We need the Kirk Institute of BS. Because let me tell you something, he's the best at it. So with that being said, you had me up until that point, quite frankly, and that's where you kind of lost me. I did like how, the captain of the Lexington, I like his reasoning for not firing on the Enterprise. Again, but I guess that's supposed to show the power of the human mind versus a computer mind. That you still need humans, so I'm sure that's part of it as well. So that's my whole thing. I mean, if we're gonna put Daystrom on a pedestal, Kirk gets the highest one of all because he's smarter than all these computers.
Does not compute. Yeah, we would be remiss. William Marshall played Dr. Richard Daystrom in this episode. And Barry Russo was Captain Wesley, who was calling for Kirk's head, but ended up not pulling the trigger. I had a weird. It made me smile when Kirk recites the famous line from the poem "Sea Fever" by John Masefield. All I ask is a tall ship and a star to steer her by. And I said, well, my God, that's Final Frontier, right? In which Spock gets the quote right. It's McCoy who says Melville, and he says, actually, John Masefield. Are you sure? I'm quite versed in the classics. Well, then how come you don't know row, row, row your boat? But it was a call ahead that I didn't even know I needed. And had I seen that when I first saw Star Trek V on June 9th, 1989, that might have saved the movie for me, because I would have said, my God, that's a callback to the Ultimate Computer. So if only I had done this in the right order, who knows what would have happened.
I think the big takeaway for all of our fans is that here at Pending Rebrand, and specifically on the Warp Core podcast, we are consistently trying to make Star Trek V better by explaining how it's actually good, and you've been wrong your whole life.
Absolutely. And also the whole M5, particularly when it starts to verbally interact, by the way, that is an uncredited James Doohan, again doing the voice. I guess that was just his thing. He liked to do alien voices, glowing orb voices, computer voices. When they needed something a little bit off kilter, say, hey, somebody find Doohan. We've got some more lines for him. I got a War Games, John Badham, 1983, Joshua. And although in this case the Joshua never actually killed anybody, but M5 blows up that ore freighter, which could have been fully crewed, but wasn't, and then does its damage in the War Games. Like I say, gentlemen, I don't want my on the gleeful, upbeat denouement conclusion to take away from really a powerful episode. I'm surprised that they went there. I'm surprised that they didn't just say, oh, they hit the nacelles. They're, it's basically a stalled car now. I'm surprised that they went with death. I'm surprised that they allowed a Starfleet captain to basically ask for permission, for the green light, for friendly fire. Like, this thing does push the envelope for what we thought would be possible in 1968 television. You wouldn't blink twice on some of these choices in Star Trek Strange New Worlds or Picard or Deep Space Nine, where, moral ambiguity was the order of the day at Quark's Bar. But to see it all the way back then, And to sort of, that's what I'm saying, is that when we hold up the mirror and force them to confront these issues, I just, like I say, I just think it deserves that full treatment and so forth. But this was a very, very gripping episode, season 2 episode. Oh, and I wish we had gotten to the point in the later Star Treks that Rick Berman produced where all ships didn't look alike. Seeing 3 Constellation class Federation ships, I want a USS Reliant out there or something, where the nacelles are in a different place or something like that. That might have been too much to ask for in '68. And it's fine to see 3 Enterprises shooting at each other, but I was looking for a little bit of diversity in the fleet, the ships of the line.
Well, you got a space battle, though.
Yeah.
And I have to say, I was excited to see a space battle that didn't involve some goofy-looking thing with a bird painted on it. I will say, I think this episode in particular happens to be one of the coolest foundational type episodes that we've come across thus far with TOS, because it raises the bar significantly for I think both the abstract and the concrete issues du jour. This is, like you said, ambitious for the time period, dealing with essentially what is a mass death situation, friendly fire, definitely topical for 1968. Definitely, dealing with some megalomania or some potentially mental dysfunction of some kind, I guess you could call it, with Dr. Daystrom. Fits of mania and depression and trying to, deal with... I don't know. I really enjoyed this episode from a storytelling aspect, because I think it delved into a lot more things than it probably realized it was delving into at the time, which is something I think Star Trek really tries for now. The fact that this was probably mostly accidental, they're just like, it sounds like a cool story to tell, winds up being probably one of the most influential episodes of all time. And I think you see that in episodes like, I just was watching Next Gen this afternoon, where Data creates his own daughter, with Lal, and you see a similar situation. Very advanced computer technology that all of a sudden goes beyond its constructs and confines and defies explanation to a certain extent, and the emotional fallout of that. I mean, what's the line from Rush Hour? Didn't nobody die, but a lot of stuff happened. And the moral ambiguity of, what Data was doing and or what Starfleet wanted to do with this new android. This is the kind of episode that, without this, without the ultimate computer, I don't think you get that. And it also begs the point, why Daystrom and not Noonien Sung? And that's a question I think is potentially going to be answered in future Star Trek movies and shows. But gentlemen, as we always do here on the Warp Core podcast, and if you haven't, do hit like, subscribe, and drop us a comment. What did you think of the ultimate computer? What are your Warp Core ratings out there, fans? I'm going to start with Fert Derby, because these questions. Was this determining your Warp Core rating, or did you come into this with a rating ahead of
6
time?
3/4. Just a nose past, for me, the ultimate prize. And like I say, we've discussed how I come there, but this episode, like you say, it's a Star Trek episode that is relevant 56 years later, and will probably be relevant in another 56 years and so forth. And like I say, some of them, they come off as corny, the future, and da-da-da. But this one absolutely just nailed the moment, as well as the timelessness of that moment. And yes, there are certain things men must do. We must forage and hunt, and I don't know. I don't know what men do these days, but darn it, there are things, and the computers will never replace them or any of us here on the Warp Core podcast. You'll never see us replaced by AI. That's a fact. So 6 3/4 Warp Cores.
Both of your arguments have helped raise the score here for me because it just I didn't like how it ended. I can't help it. So I'm gonna go. I'm gonna go. I'll go 6, just because the ending. I could. No, I'm gonna go 6. No, I'm holding to 6. I was gonna go 6.5, but I'm gonna go 6. I just didn't like him talking. You know, the computer out of it again, and I don't think we see Daystrom again. Am I correct? Is this the only time we see him?
Ooh.
Like, how do we not bring him? I don't think we see him again.
As far as I'm aware, this is the only time he ever appears in Star Trek.
How do you not bring this dude back? I mean, we got Zeb from Cochrane again
We did.
in an important Star Trek movie. How are we not going to get Daystrom? But look, guys, if there's one thing we've also established here on the Warp Core and Graying Jedi, is anytime Paramount wants to reach out to us, we are here. We are free agents. We are almost like the TNT crew that does basketball, Shaq and Barkley. We're right up there with them. So anytime Paramount, Disney wants to reach out to us, we're available.
Inside the warp core.
Just so
A
they
half
know.
hour, yeah. It's perfect.
As long as they pay me in meatballs, I'll do whatever they ask. I do love me some Charles Barkley and Shaq.
Who
Shout out to
doesn't?
those two. I hope they call sports forever. I don't care if it's curling, the Olympics.
Yes.
I'll watch. And I'm going to give those two a rating 7 out of 7 warp cores. No, I'm going to go with a 6.5 on this one, and I would go stronger. I would go 6 3/4, but I agree. Not having some denouement showing Daystrom in an asylum or entering a rehabilitation leaves me with a little bit of emptiness, I guess, if you want to call it that. I do think that could be remediated. This could be a 7. As I think Star Trek V could be moved to a 7 if
No.
they eventually, maybe in the Section 31 movie, maybe in a reboot episode, maybe in a Strange New Worlds Discovery type time loop episode, Lower Decks episode, I don't know. If they loop back to Dr. Daystrom and somehow explain what happened next. Because again, the Daystrom Institute, I mean, Daystrom, like you said, is like a saint to the Federation. So what happened after this? Was there some sort of cover-up? Why was this forgotten? Or why was this overlooked? Or what came of this that moved him just back into the ranks of revered, superstardom? Or was it that, he did end up getting rehabilitated and, something happened? I don't know. Those are the questions that I would love to see answered that I think would move this to a perfect episode. But again, it would be like a 2-parter where you kind of get your payoff 56 years later or 58 years later, whenever this happens to get, brought to light. I also think that this is one of those beautiful things about Star Trek is that the second watch, the third watch, the watch 56 years later can change the whole paradigm, and I think the fact that this remains topical even today, the fact that this remains an ambitious episode, even compared to some of the Star Trek things we've seen, I mean, you name it, we've seen a lot of things happen on Star Trek. It reinvigorates my passion for this series, and that's why it's a 6.5 for me. And I would love to hear what all of our fans think of this episode, because this was the ultimate computer. And was it the ultimate Star Trek episode for you? Maybe, maybe not. There was no Q. Could always be better. Could always add Q. Q? Well, until Q appears, to all of you out there, live long and prosper.